Wrestling Observer Newsletter. January 3, 1994. Ric Flair's 11th, or 10th, or 12th, depending on what you consider a world title and what you're willing to accept and ignore when it comes to wrestling history, world title victory was easily the most memorable of all his title wins, and created a unique emotional moment almost foreign to American wrestling. In what was easily the best job of build-up for a single match in the 5-year history of WCW, Starrcade 93, by virtue of a horrible situation that took place 2 months earlier in England, was switched from the planned Vader losing the WCW title to Sid Vicious, to Vader losing the title to Flair in a match where Flair put his career on the line. The result was what was announced as a sellout at the Charlotte Independence Arena, actually about 300 shy of capacity, probably with less papering than at any recent WCW major shows. The report we got was the house was $65,000, which is more than any WCW house in a long time, but still indicates they needed significant paper to fill the building even with all the hype nationally and in the local media because Flair is a major celebrity in town and friends with key writers and sportscasters. Most likely it also resulted in as good a pay-per-view buy rate as WCW could be capable of getting at this stage or any stage in the foreseeable future, although based on our response as far as numbers of calls, it doesn't indicate the 0.8 that some people were hoping for. But in fairness to the company, once they were forced into changing the main event, they did everything possible to not only make it work, but did a unique promotional job using the media and pushing Flair like never before. Ironically, just days before the event, something happened in the build-up that just a few years earlier would have been regarded as an absolute disaster, but in today's wrestling world was almost not even worthy of a notice. In a snafu the likes that seems to happen with alarming regularly with the company, pay-per-view ad that ran 1 week before the show in the trade magazine Multi-Channel News, featured an ad not for Starrcade, but for Super Brawl February 20, 1994, listing the main event as Flair defending the title against Vader in a Thundercage match. Ad slicks for that match had been sent to cable companies around the country well beforehand, so anyone within the cable industry with any interest in wrestling knew the result, but then again, any fan with a brain should have been able to easily figure it out as well. But the topper was 3 days later when the New York Daily News, which is I believe the largest circulated daily newspaper in the country, showed the ad for Super Brawl mentioning the snafu with the headline, "You can bet on it," saying the ad gave away that Flair was going to win the title 4 days later and said if you need some extra holiday cash, bet the ranch on Flair, if you can find someone to take the bet. Ironically, or perhaps not, the same newspaper ran a lengthy story on Flair the day before, treating Flair and pro wrestling as if it were a shoot. In addition, the ads in local newspaper TV guides around the country for the show were still listing Vader defending against Vicious as the main event. If this was just 1 year ago and Bill Watts was still in charge of WCW, he'd have pulled out what little hair he had left, torn apart several sections of the office, and probably have to be heavily sedated in order to keep from changing the finish. But it's 1 year later and nobody cared, and quite frankly, I doubt if affected the number of buys for this show one iota. In the weeks leading up to the show, Flair delivered some of the best interviews of the decade, and WCW backed it up by getting footage of other sports stars, most notably Charles Barkley, plugging the match and building up Flair. The television, while giving some build-up to other matches, focused on the main event in a manner telling everyone that this match was not the typical pay-per-view main event, thus making it not a typical pay-per-view show, and effectively got the match and thus the show over as an extra special event. The show itself, sold as a one-match show, delivered because of that. There were no expectations for the undercard, which was fortunate, because nothing underneath delivered. Because of that, it was a $24.95 pay-per-view show with only one good match out of 8, but was still a solid, in fact a major, thumbs up. The undercard was made a backdrop for hyping the main event, similar to a boxing pay-per-view. While the unique setting and uniqueness of the hype is something that neither WWF nor WCW could possibly duplicate more than once every few years, if even that, because how many enduring figures will this business produce that reach the level of Flair, let alone how many are capable of putting on the performance that created this emotion? Other aspects of building drama, showing the guys entering the arena, interviews with the main eventers interspersed throughout the card rather than just immediately before the match, for the main event to make it seem special could be done for the world title match on most pay-per-view shows effectively. Once a year, for the big match, they could even build interest by having interviews with the other leading wrestling personalities in the group analyzing and predicting a winner. In this case, having the other faces and heels both talk about Flair and his legacy would have been a nice added touch. At this pay-per-view, the maudlin approach to what could have been Flair's final match ever at one point bordered on being overdone. The show opened with a series of photos of Flair from early childhood through what appeared to be college football, a newspaper clipping of the 1975 small airplane crash that he was in with Johnny Valentine and Bob Bruggers, both of whom never wrestled again, and some others where he broke his back, and then showed clips of him in the ring from previous Starrcade main events. They aired a clip of Vader arriving in the building and working out in the ring hours before the show started. They then went to Flair's house showing Flair, wife Beth and 3 of his 4 children in an emotional setting trying to get over the idea that this really could be his last ride to his final match. Flair was then shown getting into a limo with Gene Okerlund and they talked in a manner leading you to believe it was going to be his last match. After the opener, they showed another clip of them riding to the building with more last match talk. At this point it bordered on being overdone, and finally showed them arriving at the building. The match itself was excellent when it came to drama and heat, largely because of the Charlotte crowd/hometown Flair tie-in and the build-up. It would have been a great match in any case, but not one that would be remembered for years. The match never had the heart-stopping close calls that made nearly every nightly Flair match during the mid-'80s, nor did it have the brutality that Vader's pay-per-view matches with Sting or Cactus Jack had or the level of heat and action of every Big Show Kenta Kobashi match this year. But as a total performance, and by that I don't mean bell-to-bell performance but pre-match build-up to post-match interview performance, it probably was both the best and most memorable of Flair's entire career. This was also a night where Gene Okerlund to a lesser extent got over this as something special because he tried to act largely out of character, and a main event where Tony Schiavone did the best announcing job of his career. Whether this was the last real hurrah or a career rebirth, either for WCW and or Ric Flair, will be answered by crowd reactions over the next few weeks. But no matter which it is and what the future of WCW is, Flair's role in wrestling history as its greatest all-around performer of all time, which was solidified many years ago, was defined on this night. It was the night where his versatility, interviewability, and obvious love for his sport took center stage above any wrestling match. If it seemed real at times, it probably was because, with the exception of what actually went on in the ring, which was really brutal in its own right, an awful lot of it was. Ric Flair's career rundown. Real name, Richard Morgan Fleer. Birthday, February 25, 1949. Years pro, 21, as of January 3, 1994. 1967, Minnesota High School State Heavyweight Wrestling Champion. 1969-70 played offensive guard at University of Minnesota. 1971, attended Vern Gagne's training camp in Minnesota, but dropped out. 1972, attended camp a second time, finishing, and made his pro debut on December 10, 1972, going to a draw with the late George Scrapiron Godosky. 1973, wrestled as undercard rookie in the AWA, mostly putting over another rookie, Greg Gagne. 1974, on the recommendation of Wahoo McDaniel, was brought in by Carolina's promoter Jim Crockett Jr. as a typical at the time cocky bleached blonde heel to be tag team partner with veteran Rip Hawk. Captured first championship, the old Mid-Atlantic tag team titles with Hawk beating Paul Jones and Bob Bruggers. Lost titles to Jones and Tiger Conway Jr. in early 1975. 1975, captured first singles title, the Mid-Atlantic TV title from Paul Jones. Was out of action for several months after suffering a broken back in a small airplane crash. Returned to team with Greg Valentine to win the Mid-Atlantic tag titles from Dino Bravo and Conway, the first of many tag titles held with Valentine. 1976, captured the Mid-Atlantic title for the first time from Wahoo McDaniel, beginning his most famous early career singles feud that lasted on and off for nearly 10 years. By this time Flair was being considered by many as a future world champion when the NWA was a worldwide conglomerate and its title was considered the #1 title in the wrestling world. Some members of the NWA board, which was in charge of deciding who the group's standard bearer would be, began bringing up Flair's name as a possible successor to then-champion Terry Funk. 1977, although Flair captured numerous titles in the Mid-Atlantic region and established himself as the top wrestler in a talent-laden organization, this was the year of his first major disappointment. The NWA board decided to go with Harley Race, who had more international experience and more of an international name, to replace Funk as champion rather than Flair. Flair held the Mid-Atlantic TV title a second time, gaining it from Rufus Jones, won the U.S. title for the first time from Bobo Brazil, and captured the old NWA tag team title belts twice, both times from Gene and Ole Anderson in a heel versus heel feud. 1978, the legendary Ric Flair vs. Rick Steamboat feud started in an angle where unknown newcomer Steamboat pinned Flair in a television match. During this year an angle was run where Flair came out with 2 models and taunted Steamboat, and an enraged Steamboat came out and ripped Flair's clothes off and left him in his underwear. Ironically, one of the two models in the angle was the future Bonnie Steamboat Blood, although it was many years later before the two met again. Steamboat and Flair headlined throughout the year, with Steamboat winning both the U.S. title and Mid-Atlantic TV titles from Flair during this period. By August, Flair had regained the U.S. title for a second time, winning it from Tim Woods, but Steamboat regained the title in December. Right about this time, Channel 17 in Atlanta, then known as WTCG, started getting on satellite systems, and Flair occasionally worked in Georgia on major Friday night cards, and would frequently stay over for the Saturday morning television tapings, which would in those days air that evening, and began to make a name for himself outside of the Carolinas/Virginia and Ontario/Buffalo, New York area, which in those days ran the Mid-Atlantic television show and used Crockett wrestlers as its headliners, and St. Louis, which was the NWA headquarters. Although Flair actually debuted in Japan as a rookie for the Old Eway in 1973, his first tour as a star for All Japan was in April and May, where he gained what at the time was a rare pinfall win over Giant Baba, making him an instant star. 1979, Flair turned full-fledged babyface shortly after regaining the U.S. title from Steamboat, and became undisputedly the top star in the promotion, after being turned on by Gene Anderson's stable, which included Jimmy Snuka, Iron Sheik, and Greg Valentine. Flair dropped the title to Snuka, but shortly thereafter gained the World Tag title with Blackjack Mulligan as his partner, winning and losing the titles in a feud with Paul Jones and Baron von Raschke. With the growing expansion of cable and more systems carrying Channel 17 out of Atlanta, Flair was seen on a national basis. 1980, continuing as a babyface, Flair worked mainly on top in U.S. title matches, first feuding with Snuka. After regaining the title for the fourth time on April 19 in Greensboro, his feud switched to Greg Valentine. Valentine won the title in July, before Flair regained it on Thanksgiving weekend in Charlotte, and immediately started feuding with the first wrestler who could give his mouth more than a run for its money, Roddy Piper. The Piper-Flair feud in those days was far more memorable for the interview confrontations going back and forth than the matches themselves. Flair continued to work in Georgia. 1981, on September 17, Flair captured the NWA title for the first time from Dusty Rhodes in Kansas City. He immediately became one of the most traveled champions in its history, going from circuit to circuit, mainly as a heel facing each promotion's top babyface, but remaining as a babyface in the Carolinas, but also facing babyfaces as well as heels in title defenses. At this point, Georgia Championship Wrestling had peaked in the TV ratings, averaging a weekly 6.6 every Saturday afternoon, making it the most watched show on cable television. 1982, Flair's matches with the Von Erichs began in Texas, with an August match with Kerry at Reunion Arena being the roots of a rebirth of the Dallas territory. His December 25, 1982 match with Kerry, which drew the first $100,000 gate in the history of Texas wrestling, literally set the stage for the biggest wrestling boom that part of the country had ever seen. Over the next 3 years, Flair's matches with Kerry not only sold out numerous shows in Texas, but also in as faraway places as Hawaii, Japan, and drew big crowds in the Mid-South territory. By this point in time, with the exception of Hulk Hogan, who was a regional drawing card in the Midwest, Flair was the biggest drawing card in North America. 1983, Flair lost the title for the first time on June 10 in St. Louis to Harley Race, largely to set up the first Starrcade on November 24 in Greensboro, which drew a sellout 16,000 fans and drew an additional 30,000 more in a dozen closed-circuit sites. Billed as a Flair for the Gold, Flair vowed he would retire from wrestling if he failed to win the title in a cage match against Race, the same vow that drew WCW's most interest in a main event 10 years later. While closed circuit was used in the early 70s during the heyday of Mil Mascaras in Los Angeles, several theaters were booked for closed circuit telecasts of the sold-out Olympic Auditorium matches, and later the Felt Forum, now Paramount, was used numerous times during a hot feud at Madison Square Garden. This was the most ambitious wrestling promotion since the Muhammad Ali-Antonio Inoki fiasco in 1976. The total overall gate for the show, including closed circuit, was $650,000. Which pales by comparison with the megagates of today, but it was more than any show except Ali Inoki had ever done in the history of U.S. wrestling. Flair also drew baseball stadium crowds in excess of 30,000 fans for matches in Puerto Rico and Santo Domingo against the likes of Victor Jovica and Carlitos Colon. 1984, in the Forgotten World title change, Flair dropped the strap on March 21 in Wellington, New Zealand to Race, and regained it on March 23 in Kalong, Singapore. All the wrestlers on the tour were sworn to secrecy because nobody in the US or Japan was supposed to know about the title change. However, a Japanese publication reported it, and for years it was recognized in Japan as a title change, although it was later erased from that country's NWA title history. It was never acknowledged in the United States. On May 6, Flair dropped the title to Kerry Von Erich at Texas Stadium before 32,123 fans, paying $402,000, at that time the second highest single event gate in North American wrestling history, trailing only the Sammartino vs. Abishkoshe Stadium match in 1980. Flair regained the title from Kerry on May 24 in Yokosuka, Japan. The key event of this year was the media blitz the WWF received and its acquisition of the TBS time slot that made Flair a national name when McMahon bought out several partners in the old Georgia Championship Wrestling Incorporated company. After numerous complaints to TBS about the change, Ted Turner ordered an early Saturday morning show which a new Georgia group headed by Ole Anderson tried to hold together, and Flair still made as many tapings as his schedule would allow. 1985, the year of the first WrestleMania, saw the media spotlight hit pro wrestling. Flair, in the wrong place, was usually ignored in all the stories or mentioned as a brief afterthought, even though he traveled throughout the U.S. and the world and remained one of the two biggest drawing cards in the country behind only Hogan. At the end of this year, Flair had been in the main event on 7 of the 10 largest gates in North American pro wrestling history. In April, Jim Crockett purchased the TBS time slot from Vince McMahon for a reported $1 million, who Ted Turner had ordered off the station, and immediately with the national vehicle, became the second most powerful promoter in the country, and set the stage for a national expansion that eventually killed a 50-year-old family sports promoting business. The first Great American Bash took place on July 4, selling out Charlotte Baseball Stadium to the tune of 30,000 fans as Flair beat Nikita Koloff in the main event. In a controversial move, Booker Dusty Rhodes turned Flair heel on Rhodes. At first there were numerous problems because even though they did a hot angle in Atlanta where Flair and what later became known as the Four Horsemen turned on Rhodes after a cage match where Flair and Rhodes had been partners, numerous fans wouldn't boo Flair, particularly in the home base. Still, no matter who was cheered or booed, Flair vs. Rhodes did $936,000 for the third Starrcade in their first grudge match after the angle, which was split between the Greensboro Coliseum and the Omni in Atlanta. What would have been a destroying of all previous records 1 year earlier actually paled in comparison to the several $1 million WWF took in at the first WrestleMania. 1986, Flair and Rhodes, often with the Road Warriors and Russians in the semifinals, drew huge business nearly everywhere Crockett Promotions ran. While the NWA smaller promotions started their downward slide, the NWA became more and more simply Jim Crockett Promotions. With Flair as his biggest draw, Crockett made it more and more difficult for other promotions to use Flair, and without access to the world champion and the money he brought in, the smaller promotions started dying out, although they inevitably would have only slightly slower anyway. Crockett himself started expanding and had a banner year. In another controversial move, Flair moved from being the centerpiece of the promotion to simply its top heel, as the Four Horsemen were formed, with Flair being part of a group. Flair dropped the title on July 26 in Greensboro to Dusty Rhodes, but regained it on August 9 in St. Louis, for title win number 4, by U.S. records, or 5. The final Starrcade ever at the Greensboro Coliseum, split with the Omni, plus the numerous closed circuit sites, drew $980,000 with Flair vs. Nikita Koloff on top, even at this late date with WWF pretty well owning the media spotlight and the key major markets. 1987, the Crockett machine began faltering this year by attempting to become a national promotion and spending far more than it took in. Much of the problem traced to buying out Bill Watts' Mid-South promotion and its 100-plus station syndicated network, many of which were deals that required the promotion to pay the station for airtime. When ad sales for that same airtime didn't come close to projections, and house shows started faltering, the company found itself in major financial trouble. With business on the downslide, the man on top, Flair, became a scapegoat in many's eyes. Flair's role as champion differed from most of the NWA champs of the past in that he rarely won his matches at the house shows after he became a heel everywhere. With Crockett using him on every show rather than him touring, among numerous reasons, and this wasn't the main one but an important one, Flair's new role killed business in the Crockett strongholds through what became known years later as Dusty screw job finishes. Actually, this was hardly a Dusty invention, and champs of the past used them frequently, but the champs of the past never appeared on every house show in a city, and in the past the screw jobs were used to set up return matches that would have conclusive finishes, thus the stories had a beginning, middle and end, and in the end the champion was the champion and hopefully the local star was protected enough that he'd still mean something. But it changed when the screw jobs simply led to more screw jobs and the champion never went over at the end. It was thought because of Flair's interviews that he was bulletproof from being hurt by these finishes, But the arena business started its collapse because that wasn't the case. Crockett's expenditures were such that his company couldn't handle the decreasing revenues from the house shows faltering. Flair dropped the title on September 25 in Detroit to Ron Garvin, a very tough, believable wrestler but one without a national main event reputation. Literally, Garvin wasn't even among the top 5 or 6 babyfaces in the promotion at this time, but he was the only one Booker Rhodes was willing to sacrifice to have to a clean job at Starrcade for Flair, thus was given the short title reign. Crockett literally banked the whole company on the windfall he felt Starrcade, this time on pay-per-view, marking the first NWA pay-per-view show ever, only the 4th in history, would give him. The show was moved to Chicago because Greensboro didn't sound cosmopolitan enough. But Vince McMahon, coming off what would end up being his most show ever in WrestleMania 3, ran a counter pay-per-view event and flexed his muscles earned as the king of pay-per-view, saying no company that ran the Crockett event could run his event. With the WWF's track record, Starrcade was killed as only 5 companies in the entire country carried it, and thus was the beginning of the end for Jim Crockett Promotions. Flair regained the title in Cage to end a horrendous Starrcade in Chicago, where babyface Garvin was literally booed out of the building. 1988, as crowds continued to falter, the man at the top, Flair, started getting the rap of being stale, unable to draw and old. Problems escalated with Booker Rhodes. Although Flair retained the title all year, it was not without its share of problems. One of his crowning moments came on March 27, which was Crockett's revenge for McMahon's killing his Starrcade. Crockett and TBS put together the first Clash of Champions from Greensboro, head-to-head with WrestleMania. While it's hard to ascertain just how many buys the free show cost WrestleMania, the losses of potential revenue to McMahon were probably in the millions. At the first Clash, Flair went to a 45-minute draw and retained his title against a young wrestler named Sting, who literally was just another young wrestler with a little popularity coming into the match, and came out of the match as the hottest new wrestling star in the country. The show, which drew a 5.6 rating, was the highest-rated wrestling show of the modern NWA/WCW era, a rating that likely will never be surpassed. With muscles and steroids in their height of prominence, it was Lex Luger that was being groomed as Flair's heir apparent, so Sting was quickly put on the back burner. All sorts of power plays were taking place at this time, as Flair and Luger did screw job finish after screw job finish, opening to the best houses the company did all year after the screw jobs with other opponents had killed most of the cities. In rapid order, the big gates plummeted dramatically when the lessons of the past weren't learned. For most of the summer it became well known that Crockett, in debt past his eardrums, would have to sell the company, and negotiations went on all year with Turner Broadcasting. In November, the deal was consummated for a reported $9 million price. Flair, Rhodes, and Crockett had numerous problems, ego clashes and what have you, as the crowds continually dropped and Rhodes constantly blamed the man on top and felt they needed a change. As it turned out, Flair nearly jumped to the WWF, as Tully Blanchard and Arnold Anderson had just a few months earlier. If that had happened, the wrestling world as we know it, for better or worse, would not exist. It is well known TBS was going to pull out of the deal without Flair, and Crockett couldn't have survived in business with all the losses as he was already in debt. At that point, McMahon was the closest he ever would be to having a true wrestling monopoly in the United States. Finally, irrationality took over. Rhodes booked a Starrcade where Flair would drop the title in 5 minutes to Rick Steiner, which caused Flair to walk out. When orders came from above that Starrcade would be headlined by Flair versus Lex Luger, with Flair getting an unheard-of pinfall victory, it was clear it was near the end for Rhodes, who was dumped as booker at the end of the year. 1989, at the age of 40, after being written off by some, Flair responded with what in many ways was the best year of his career, largely due to classic nationally televised matches against Rick Steamboat and Terry Funk. Flair dropped the strap to Steamboat on February 20 in Chicago in an all-time classic. The two followed it up with a 56 minutes match in New Orleans, before Flair regained the title on May 7 in Nashville. Those 3 matches, and another in the Capitol Center, were widely touted as some of the greatest matches of the 1980s. Flair quickly segued into a feud with Funk, which resulted in the last $100,000 houses for regular house shows the promotion would ever see, and its highest buy rate in history, 1.5, another record that will never be surpassed, for the Great American Bash against Funk. At this point, with bookers having come and gone in rapid order, Flair did a power play of his own and demanded the book. Flair's booking reign was memorable for several reasons. First, television ratings increased to their highest level in years. While house show attendance wasn't strong, it was far higher than it would ever get again. The downside was that Ric Flair, world champion wrestler, began showing the strains on his face of being Booker and world champion at the same time, and it even began showing in the ring. Even as perhaps his finest year as a pro was ending, he was being blamed more and more for the company's inability to draw, since he wore both hats as world champion and Booker. Both Sting and Luger were mentioned as saviors of the company, which supposedly needed a young face on top to draw its lacking kids audience and sell merchandise and simply survive. 1990, the young face chosen by all was Sting, who was supposed to win the title in February in Greensboro. That was no problem since Flair himself was more than willing to put Sting over. Problems would have erupted afterwards since Booker Flair's plan was to eventually regain the title from Sting for the record-tying 7th time, while others in the company simply felt Flair's time at the top was over and there should be no number 7. Having passed the magical age of 40 was largely cited, plus WCW's inability to draw younger viewers was supposed to be somehow remedied by putting Sting, its top attraction with whatever limited number of kids watched, on top. However, 2 weeks before the match, Sting's knee was blown out doing an angle with Flair in Corpus Christi, Texas. Luger, then a heel, was turned emergency face to feud with Flair while Sting was on the mend. Flair, burned out by the constant infighting, just after delivering a weekend of 4.0 and 4.4 ratings on Saturday and Sunday, resigned as Booker. Shortly thereafter, new booking committee and Jim Herd decided to put the title on Luger, which Flair refused to do, citing a controversial contractual clause which gave him veto power. When Sting came back on July 7 in Baltimore, he finally won the title from Flair, and at that point it was well known that it was the end of the Ric Flair era as champion, that there would be no record-tying number 7, and Sting gave Flair a send-off speech to a largely confused Baltimore audience by calling Flair the greatest champion in wrestling history. It was well known, except it wasn't the case, as some who understood what the business really was and what would happen knew beforehand. It was evident that no matter whose fault it was, that the promotion was doomed as a major force, since only 8,900 fans paid to see a match that by all means should have been an easy and automatic sellout if Sting really was going to be the answer. Sting's weaknesses showed through in the spotlight, as it was obvious they would when put under a microscope. Crowds and interest continued to fall despite the title change. This time it was Sting unfairly getting the blame. The company, at this point, was largely in a shambles, but still in a far stronger position than they would be in years later. 1991, sporting a new haircut, Flair regained the title for the record-tying 7th time on January 11 at the Meadowlands in New Jersey. At this point, the title's name changed from NWA to WCW. Sting's frustration was epitomized as he did little in the match that was memorable more for the snowstorm in New Jersey that night that kept the crowd to 5,000 than for anything that happened in the ring. Sting was largely booed by the live crowd, even though he was pushed in the top face position as fans wanted Flair back on top after the failed reign. Just days later, Flair's old nemesis, The Dream, returned as Booker, with inside rumors saying priority numero uno was to gain revenge on the person he felt largely cost him his booking job 2 years earlier. A disputed title switch took place when the Dusty Finish made its way to the Tokyo Dome on March 21 in a match with Tatsumi Fujinami before a sellout 64,500 fans, which is still the largest wrestling crowd and indoor sports crowd ever in Japan. Fujinami pinned Flair to gain the title, but the decision was reversed by the over-the-top rope DQ being called moments before the pin by a second referee after a ref bump. The NWA title still was regarded as the number 1 belt in Japan because of historical reasons going back to the days of Lou Thesz, and Fujinami becoming champ was huge news. In Japan it was billed that Fujinami was NWA champ, albeit without a belt, and Flair was WCW champ. On May 19 in St. Petersburg, when Flair pinned Fujinami, he regained the NWA title and the belts were his won. In the United States, it was simply viewed that it was a DQ finish and no title changed hands. But the tension continued, since the superbooker and self-proclaimed genius was unable to turn around business, so once again it was Flair's fault. Actually, by this point the company was on such a downward slide, no single person was to blame and no single person could stop the fall. Flair was scheduled once again to drop the title to Luger in July in Baltimore and the Great American Bash for the final time. At this point a major contract dispute came down between Flair and Herd, with Flair wanting a contract extension in exchange for dropping the strap cleanly. Herd also wanted to negotiate down an existing year on Flair's contract, which at the time was in the $700,000 per year range. Negotiations came down to the wire, and the decision was made to instead drop the title 2 weeks before the pay-per-view, at a television taping in Macon, Georgia to Barry Windham. It was touch and go whether Flair would show up at the taping, but officially before the taping he most likely would have no-shown. Flair was fired by Herd. With Flair off the show, The bash turned into the We Want Flair protest show and was quite possibly the worst pay-per-view show in wrestling history. Technically, Flair retained the NWA title as its paper board refused to go along with Herd, as the NWA/WCW were having their own disputes at the time. That meant nothing in reality other than it showed the NWA and WCW title weren't one and the same. After years of coming close to making the move, Flair, who sat out the summer while being paid his $14 Gs per week by WCW, was finally in the WWF in September. By October, the long-awaited Ric Flair vs. Hulk Hogan series of matches took place. They opened to big crowds, but the crowds didn't sustain, and overall this series didn't come close to achieving expectations either in match quality or at the box office. It was largely felt that WWF blew it by rushing Flair into the mix as a WWF performer rather than keeping the illusion of him as a separate entity. 1992, at the Royal Rumble, on January 19 in Albany, New York, Flair was given the WWF title. He was the second man in the Rumble, and focal point of the entire match, going 60 minutes before everyone else was eliminated, and he joined Buddy Rogers as the only wrestlers to hold both the NWA and WWF singles title. He held the title until April 5 at WrestleMania at the Hoosier Dome in Indianapolis to Randy Savage. Flair regained the title from Savage on September 1 in Hershey, Pennsylvania at a TV taping in a match that went 15 minutes, then was stopped because Vince McMahon didn't like how it was going, and they were sent out and redid the match about a half hour later. Business was going great guns during Flair's first reign on top of the WWF, although it wouldn't be any fairer to give Flair major credit for it than to blame him for all the periods business wasn't good when he was on top for various companies. There were various reasons WWF business plummeted after Flair lost to Savage, and that title switch would be very low on any list. However, when Flair regained the title, business dropped again. At this point, two of the company's top babyfaces, Davey Boy Smith and Ultimate Warrior, both left within days of each other. At this point, the company was forced to create an immediate babyface superstar to carry the promotion. In a rushed fashion, and with almost no notice, Bret Hart, considered an excellent worker, but someone who never would have even been considered for champion by previous WWF title standards, got the nod in the title from Flair on October 12 in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. The Hart vs. Flair rematches didn't draw, although many of the matches were great. Despite the fact the matches were well above typical WWF main event quality, it started a legit feud between the two because of heat on who would call the match and what they'd do during the matches, which resulted in Hart claiming Flair was the most overrated wrestler ever privately while he was still in the promotion, and publicly the following year after Flair had left. By the end of the year, it was obvious Flair's days on top in the WWF were numbered, which in the WWF meant a significant decrease in pay. Although no doubt he'd always have a key position since both his work rate and interview ability were still second to none, he would not be a headliner, thus not get main eventer money. At the same time, Bill Watts was running WCW and under much pressure to get something going. The We Want Flair chants, which started almost immediately upon Flair's departure some 18 months earlier, continued unabated. Watts opened negotiations for the home run move of bringing Flair back. After TV ratings on Sunday showed a marked increase when the company aired reruns of the 1989 Steamboat series with Flair, TBS, looking at ratings first, saw Flair getting Flair to return as something important once again. 1993, Flair and WCW put together a deal, with Flair losing a loser leaves town match to Mr. Perfect to end his WWF reign on a Monday Night Raw, which drew a shockingly low 2.6 rating. Flair arrived as a full-fledged babyface in WCW just days after Watts was given the heave-ho to a King's reaction in Asheville, North Carolina. Although he was doing interviews weekly on television in March, his debut was held back until June 16 in order to draw a Clash rating, a strategy that failed miserably with a 2.6 rating for a tag match with he and Arnold Anderson against Brian Pillman and Steve Austin, the lowest-rated Clash in history. His number of title reigns became completely unclear, often referred to at this point as 9 WCW title reigns. In reality, he finally broke Harley Race's record to absolutely no fanfare, since the record he chased his whole career was simply forgotten. The record breaker was never even acknowledged in a July 18 NWA title win over Barry Windham, a disappointing match in Biloxi, Mississippi. He lost that title on September 17 to Rick Rude in Houston in another disappointing match. Despite having several strong matches on television during this time, the back-to-back below-standard matches and Flair's chronological age caused more talk than ever that he was through on top. With the exception of a few increased television ratings, Flair's return to WCW, while causing initial major commotion, was handled poorly, meant little as far as television ratings, and nothing as far as pay-per-view and house show business. He was in the process of being phased down and out, with Starrcade, the event he built, which at one time was the premier wrestling event of the year, taking place in his hometown, and he was scheduled third from the top in a tag match with longtime nemesis Steamboat against the Nasty Boys, a positioning that would have made any singles comeback even more difficult. While many, even most, considered Flair still among the top 5 or 6 workers in North America, when someone has been number 1 in the world for 10 years and considered by many as the greatest ever, any fall from that vaunted greatest position and from the top of the card when the big event is in his hometown is going to be noticeable to everyone. Somehow, as happened in 1988 when he was blamed by a booker who ruined the title in all the court towns with screw job finishes for not being able to draw, as happened in 1989 when management deemed him too old and blamed him for not being able to draw with management that didn't know the first thing about the emotions that put fans in the seats, as happened in 1990 when he was finally removed from the top, as happened in 1991 when the same management that gave up on him and blamed him put him right back on top, as happened again in 1991 when that same management fired him, and has continued to happen, when he was written off as being past his prime and having outlived his usefulness, he somehow was back on top in very short order. The ultimate irony was not that Ric Flair's finest hour as a professional wrestler came many years after numerous people in management, and even many fans had come to the conclusion his days as a key performer were over. It was because a man with every obvious sign of disaster written all over him going in was still being handed the company's top star position by a new management team that somehow understood even less than the previous inept management, freaked out and nearly killed Ric's best friend in real life, that all this took place with nowhere to go, as happened time after time when the ideas that were going to save the company failed and the saviors self-destructed. The only idea left was to go back to Ric Flair. Somehow this time the end result was the greatest production and greatest performance in the history of the company. Flair pinned Vader in 21-11 to win the WCW title. Tremendous storyline and psychology. Pretty much everyone knew that Flair was going to win, so Vader just destroyed him early to the point it raised serious doubt. Whenever Flair would get an advantage, Harley Race would interfere and turn the tables. A Vader clothesline busted Flair's lip, mouth and tongue and loosened some of his teeth, and he was bleeding badly the rest of the way. After kicking out of a superplex, Flair made a comeback working on Vader's knee, wrapping it around the post and hitting him with a chair. It turned into some great brawling outside the ring. After another Vader cutoff, he missed a splash and Flair got him in the figure 4, but Vader made the ropes. Finally Vader missed a moonsault, Flair went for the cover, Vader kicked Flair off, and at the same moment 50-year-old King Harley came off the top rope with a diving headbutt and hit Vader. Flair tried a tackle, but he was the one who went down. As Vader turned his back, Flair clipped Vader and schoolboyed him for the pin. 4.5 stars. March 22, 1999. It took all of 70 seconds for the Ric Flair-Hulk Hogan double turn to take place at the WCW Uncensored pay-per-view show on March 14 at Freedom Hall in Louisville, and by the end of the match, Hogan had been screwed so many times by bad officiating that the turn was complete, even with the stipulation of Flair having to retire should he lose. So when the dust cleared, Flair captured his 14th, or 18th, or 22nd, more on that later, version of the World Heavyweight title. This adds to the list that makes him not only the most decorated of the so-called Major League champions in history, but now makes him the oldest man, at 50, ever to hold at least what purports to be this version of the alleged fictitious history version of the 1905 title. Luthez lost the NWA World Heavyweight title for the final time at the age of 49 in 1966. Both Fez, Nick Bockwinkel and Vern Gagne held versions of the world title well past the age of 50, and Mil Mascaras probably still holds that IWA title today, although that was probably never considered a major league title past the age of 60. The NWA title really isn't the same title Flair just won, although it could be said to be, since it's the same physical belt that at one time was worn by Flair and many others as NWA World Champion from 1986 through the early 90s. Exactly how many times Flair has been champion, and what exactly constitutes being a world champion and how it affects that number was the subject of an item sent us by Richard Sullivan, claiming this as Flair's 22nd world title reign, and after looking through the list I'd say 18 is probably the closest thing to a realistically accurate, although I suppose 22 would be the technically accurate number. This is how he reached that number, and I'll have comments to make on this listing as well. Flair won the NWA title for the first time, beating Dusty Rhodes on September 17, 1981 in Kansas City. It is claimed that he lost that title on February 9, 1982 in Tampa to the Midnight Rider, who was Dusty Rhodes under a mask, who had lost a loser leaves town match to Kevin Sullivan, and thus was suspended. As the storyline went at the time, Bob Geigel, who was the NWA president at the time, after the match ordered him to unmask and he refused, since unmasking revealing Rhodes would lead to a suspension for life, or 1 year, or whatever it was in those days. The stip of the match was if Flair won, he'd have to unmask, so the deal was sold as either Flair would win and Rhodes would be suspended for life in a show called The Night of the Mask, or that Ryder would win the title, and either had to happen. By refusing to unmask, the title was given back that night to Flair. I personally wouldn't consider this a title change. Wrestling Title Histories lists the Flair vs. Midnight Rider match as being February 9, 1983 in Tampa. Since I don't have observers dating back that far, although we were around, who knew back then that anyone would care about such things as wrestling history 15 years later, I can't verify things happened exactly like that, but I'm basically certain this match actually took place in Miami Beach and not Tampa, because I went to spring break in Fort Lauderdale about 6 weeks after the Night of the Mask and a lot of the local kids were talking about it. It is possible they did the same angle in both cities, as that often happened in those days, but I remember the Florida television that I watched regularly, and I'm pretty sure they were building the match up specifically for one night and not as a weekly tour match, and that night was in Miami Beach, but I'm sure others can verify the date and place of that match. So Flair being handed back the title would be listed as number 2 on the Sullivan list, which ended in a match in late 1982 or early 1983 in the Dominican Republic against Jack Veneno, which Flair won back a few days later for number 3. Flair did the same gimmick with Victor Jovica, I believe, in Santo Domingo. These two title changes were never acknowledged in North America, and info in those days wasn't as prevalent and never supposed to be known. Virtually nobody knew about them. Eventually we got unconfirmed rumors of big baseball stadium shows with incredible crowds and Flair doing losses and wins in a 1-week period, as they had done in Japan with Baba in the past. Flair years later confirmed both stories as being true. I've never myself seen the dates listed as to when they took place, and the word we heard was the nights Flair lost in both cases drew baseball stadium crowds in excess of 25,000. I'm not even sure this was the correct time frame for those series of matches. Flair was always recognized in the States as champion during this period until dropping it to Harley Race on June 10, 1983 in St. Louis, and then regained it at the first Starrcade in a cage match on November 24, 1983 in Greensboro. Not listed anywhere was another of those weird deals in another universe, as in December 1983 there was definitely a cage match in Puerto Rico where Carlos Colon beat Flair in what may not have been billed as an NWA World Title match, but was to determine who the real undisputed world champion was, as Colon was recognized at the time as WWC World Champion. This may have been an out-the-door finish as opposed to a pin, but again, I'm not sure, and believe that when Colon beat Flair, the unified title was referred to as the Universal Heavyweight title, since the universe is bigger than the world, and that's remained the top singles title in that promotion to this day, but Flair went home still holding the NWA World title. Flair then lost on March 21, 1984 to Race in Wellington, New Zealand, but regained it 2 days later in Kalong, Singapore. This was also supposed to be a secret done on a Steve Rickard tour, and probably none of these title changes except the major ones that stuck were ever approved by the NWA board, and local promoters simply felt they could do something in their own part of the world and nobody would ever find out in the main office. And with Mushnick no longer NWA president, there was nobody in the NWA worried about credibility of the title for a decade anyway. I recall that wrestlers on this tour was sworn to secrecy about the double title switch, but we got the word anyway as photos of Race winning the title in Wellington appeared in a Japanese wrestling magazine, and later one of the wrestlers on the tour, once the word got out, informed me that it went back in Singapore and how it was supposed to be this big secret. As a realistic number, the win in Singapore would be number 5, although most NWA record books at this point would only list the win over Rhodes and the win over Race and Flair as 2-time champion. Kerry Von Erich beat Flair on May 6, 1984 at Texas Stadium in a very famous match, but Flair regained it on May 24, 1984 in Yokosuka, Japan. At Starrcade in 1985 on November 28, 1985 in Atlanta, the closed-circuit crowd pay-per-view was in its infancy, but this show didn't air on pay-per-view. Rhodes beat Flair as the show ended, but the next week on the weekend television it was said that after the fact the decision was changed to Rhodes winning on a DQ because there was outside interference against Rhodes before the title switch. Rhodes finally won the title on July 26, 1986 in Greensboro as a setup for Flair's 4th in storyline but 7th or 8th depending on what you consider the Midnight Rider deal to be, title win on August 9, 1986 in St. Louis. Flair lost to Ron Garvin on September 25, 1987 in Detroit, basically to set up the Starrcade main event on November 26, 1987 in Chicago, with Flair regaining it, which we should call number 8, which was the first ever NWA pay-per-view show. Ricky Steamboat beat Flair on February 20, 1989 in Chicago, and Flair regained it on May 7, 1989 in Nashville, billed number 6, but we'll call number 9. Sting beat Flair on July 7, 1990 in Baltimore, and at this point they started calling the belt the WCW belt as well as the NWA belt, and the WCW initials were used more often. I can recall that night vividly, as that was when the hierarchy at WCW decided Sting was the man and Flair's career as a headliner was over. Historically, Harley Race had 7 NWA title reigns, really 8, Lou Thesz had 6, although Thesz probably had more than a dozen over various different world titles, and 6 was a recreated history story, and it was actually a bigger deal politically at the time than you'd ever think that Flair was never going to get the chance to get number 7 and number 8 to break Race's record. Of course, Sting failed and Flair got it anyway in January 11, 1991 in East Rutherford, New Jersey, which was billed as tying Race's record and was pretty much considered a major historical occasion at the time, which I guess shows how much times change, because things like this now seem to ridiculously silly. On March 21, 1991 at the Tokyo Dome, Tatsumi Fujinami beat Flair on a match taped for American pay-per-view with a dusty finish. In the building to the fans, Fujinami left as NWA World Champion, which was a big deal because I was there that night and the Japanese were celebrating like they had just won the war. But backstage they did the angle where the Americans stole the belt back because the American ref saw the over-the-top rope DQ before the pinfall. Flair returned home as champion. In Japan, they claimed that Flair took possession of the belt because WCW ruled about the DQ, but that Fujinami, who I don't believe wore a belt during this period nor did he ever defend the title, was introduced at the matches as the NWA World Champion, although it's doubtful that the NWA Board of Governors, such as they existed in those days, ever ruled as such. On May 19, 1991, Flair beat Fujinami in St. Petersburg in what was billed as simply a title defense in the US but a title unification match in Japan. This is where it gets confusing. To get to number 22, Flair's win over Sting was billed as winning 2 titles, WCW and NWA, which technically were always 2 different belts although were basically the same thing at the time, and beating Fujinami gets the number up to 13. I'd consider Fujinami's claim as valid since New Japan was the first or second biggest wrestling company in the world at the time, so let's call the St. Pete win number 11. This is where politics got real interesting. On 2 separate occasions at house shows, Flair was supposed to drop the title to Lex Luger and refused. Television cameras were even brought to house shows in both Chicago and St. Louis to film title changes that didn't take place, as he was at major odds with Jim Herd, who ran WCW at the time. This was actually in background very similar to the McMahon-Hart story. Flair tried to hold WCW for a contract extension since once again they were planning on phasing him from the top, again remarkably similar to the Hart deal, although Flair played his cards a little different and perhaps smarter from a self-preservation standpoint, as he didn't make the mistake of trusting the wrong people in the ring, and in doing so wanted to cut his money greatly. Finally, Flair was supposed to drop the title to Luger on a pay-per-view show on July 14, 1991 in Baltimore, which turned out to be an infamously bad night of wrestling. Then Herd, for whatever reason, changed his mind again because of all the heat with Flair over the contract by this point and ordered a title switch immediately, and a television taping about 2 weeks earlier, to Barry Windham. Flair no-showed the taping. Herd fired Flair and the WCW title was held up until Luger beat Windham on that July 14th show. At this point the NWA, such as it was, which actually didn't even promote wrestling in those days, basically broke from WCW and ruled that Flair was still the champion, and that the WCW title wasn't the NWA title. Flair never wrestled as NWA champion nor anywhere before going to the WWF with the gold belt emblematic of both the NWA and WCW champion. Flair took the actual belt with him, which is now the current WCW belt, and Luger and Windham wrestled for a different physical belt. Flair worked in WWF with the NWA physical belt until WCW sued WWF about the belt and won the case. Flair and McMahon then created almost an identical-looking belt for Flair to wear as real world champion, but never being recognized nor defending any title in WWF, and they were back in court again and WWF lost again. A few weeks after this second loss in court, Flair won the WWF title on January 19, 1992 in Albany in the Royal Rumble, which we'll call No. 12. Flair lost it at WrestleMania on April 5, 1992 in Indianapolis to Randy Savage, and regained it on September 1, 1992 in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Flair's first WWF reign was a success, but the second was becoming a total bust, and in what at the time was almost a shocking panic move, the WWF went with, not an unknown, but someone who conventional wisdom didn't see as a potential champion, a guy named Bret Hart who beat Flair on October 12, 1992 in Saskatoon. Before long, McMahon wanted to move Flair out of the main events, and Bill Watts, who was running WCW, made Flair a big money offer to return. McMahon had always promised Flair if he moved him out of main events that he'd allow him to leave, even with the contact, and turned out to be a man of his word in this case and let Flair go, provided Flair go out doing jobs on the way out, including a televised loser leaves match against Curt Hennig, which he lost. On July 18, 1993, Flair beat Barry Windham in Biloxi, Mississippi to win the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. The NWA and WCW had mended fences under Watts and Seiji Sakaguchi, and had revived the title 1 year earlier in Japan, which would be number 14. In September, the NWA and WCW had their second and final dispute. WCW wanted Flair to drop the NWA title to Rick Rude. The NWA board, which existed but had no actual power in wrestling anymore, voted to refuse to allow the switch. Of course, WCW did so anyway, and another court fight ensued, which the NWA won, and the title Rude won was instead called the WCW International Heavyweight title. However, WCW did win the rights to the physical belt, as one of the things Turner purchased when buying the company from Jim Crockett, whose company and not the NWA bought the belt for Flair in 1986. Number 15 was the famous Flair-Vader Starrcade match on December 27, 1993 in Charlotte, capturing the WCW title. The title was held up after a double pin finish in a pay-per-view match against Steamboat on April 17, 1994, and Flair won the rematch on April 24, 1994 in Atlanta at Center Stage. This match is listed at number 18 on the Sullivan list, but most consider the title being held up and the Flair win and simply maintenance of the title, so I'd consider it 15 at this point still. On June 23, 1994, Flair beat Sting, who held the WCW International title, which was the physical old NWA belt, in Charleston, South Carolina, to basically unify the titles into one for when Hogan came in to beat Flair on July 17, 1994 in Orlando. This win is listed at number 19 by Sullivan, but I don't consider it a world title win even though it was the physical world title belt. It had been called international title for the previous 9 months. Number 16 would be Flair's win over Randy Savage at Starrcade 95 in Nashville on December 27, 1995, which lasted until losing on January 22, 1996 in Las Vegas. Number 17 would be Flair's win over Savage on February 11, 1996 in St. Petersburg, which he lost to the Giant on April 22, 1996 in Albany, Georgia, which would make this week's win at number 18, although you can call it 14, or 22, or basically any number in between that you'd like. This is the end of this conversion. Be sure to comment and subscribe. See you next time.